Well, hello and welcome to the Institute of Managers and Leaders, and it's wonderful that so many of you could join us for what will be 3 very engaging sessions exploring the topic of workplace communication. My name is Sam Bell, I'm the Chief Executive of the Institute, and it's my pleasure to host this first session with Dr. Tim Baker of our Development Day today on performance conversations that leaders must have. Can I firstly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, right across Australia and New Zealand. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Institute of Managers and Leaders is the peak body for management and leadership and the largest member community for managers and leaders across Australia and New Zealand. This Development Day, our third for the year, is just part of a great suite of learning and development resources that we make available to organisations across Australia and New Zealand. This includes short courses, webinars, events, and a range of signature leadership and development programs. Let's crack into Development Day now, and the unprecedented change that has taken place over the last few years has had serious repercussions on how, when, and why we communicate in the workplace. Whilst the basis of the communication model has remained largely unchanged, the channels, the source of noise, and the quality of feedback can often be confusing and complicated in the workplace. Add into the mix technological change, and now with 5 generations in the workforce all at once, many aspects of the workplace communication have become a lot more challenging. A recent US survey by Forbes suggests that workers are now spending around 20 hours per week using digital communication tools. Whilst this is leading to an increase in a feeling of connectivity, burnout rates are on the increase as the divide between both work and home has diminished. Surprisingly, around half the workers in the survey reported reduced efficiency due to ineffective communication in the workplace. And as I get around to many of our campuses across Australia and New Zealand and speak to our members, I hear regularly from senior managers and chief executives that communication is the root cause for most workplace breakdowns. So let's get down to business then. And it's my pleasure, as I said, to introduce Dr. Tim Baker for this first session. The session's called Performance and Development Conversations Leaders Must Have. And I'm particularly delighted to have Dr. Tim Baker joining us today. The days of a once-a-year performance review are thankfully, hopefully behind us in most workplaces today. The most effective and most underrated tool a leader has in their kit bag is the ability to connect through regular performance and development conversations. Ideally, these conversations need to take on different forms at different times. And Tim has kindly offered to navigate us through how we have these conversations. Just a little bit about Tim before I let him loose on you. Dr. Tim Baker is a leadership and change expert who assists managers to improve individual and organisational performance. He has consulted across 21 industries within government, private sector, and not-for-profit. Tim has an award-winning PhD in organisational change, and he has conducted major consulting assignments across many overseas countries. Tim is the author of 16 books, including his latest, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. So before I get Tim on, just a little bit of housekeeping, because I know this is the first session and I want everyone to be fully engaged. So just before we start, I want to make sure that your microphones are on mute during the presentation, but that of course doesn't stop you from communicating directly with both Tim and myself. You'll see in front of you, you've got a question and answer box. So please feel free at any time during Tim's presentation to put in some questions throughout, and we will have time for a Q&A session with Tim at the end of the presentation. But moreover, if you'd like to make some comments as Tim is going and to sort of spur some of that conversation with the over 700 people on today's webinar, there's a webinar chat. And so you can see the webinar chat in front of you. You can always put some comments into there and Tim will perhaps ask some questions throughout and you can put some answers into there. So it makes it very interactive for today's 700 people on the webinar. So please use those two in front of you and ensure that your microphone remains muted. And as I said, there'll always be an opportunity for us to go through some of the Q&A questions at the end with Tim. So let's get started. I also hope, just one quick thing, I hope you've got your action plans downloaded in front of you. The action plans are really important from our perspective as a learning and development provider. And it's very true to our heart that all learning that you get some, you're able to apply the learning straight away. So whatever Tim's talking about and the tips and techniques and the discussion that Tim puts down in front of you, we obviously want you to take away a lot of that information and apply that straight into your workplace as a manager and leader in your workplace. So please use those action plans and have them at the ready for each of today's 3 sessions. But without further ado, I will hand over to Tim and look forward to some Q&A throughout the session. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome everybody. Looking forward to working with you in my short session with you today, and it's great to be here. And I think one of the biggest changes that Sam alluded to there is the hybrid working conditions that we've got. And of course, hybrid working's been occurring for a period of time before COVID, but what COVID did, of course, is accelerate it. Of course, not everybody can work from home, but many can, and I think this is something that's going to be here to stay. And you might say, well, if that's the case, then how do we have conversations with people in that forum? And of course, you can do that via these sorts of medium, and you should. And I would argue that this is more important now than ever before to have those regular catch-ups and conversations with your people if they're working remotely. But I'll address that a little bit later on in the presentation. So let's have a look. There are 3 key things that I'd like to, share with you during this session. I just want to talk about the power of conversation. I think sometimes we underrate conversation and its power and its relevance. And I think it's one of the most underrated tools that a manager has in their kit bag. I want to talk about some of the barriers around communication, because obviously there are a lot of barriers. And I'm going to share with you 9 of those barriers. And what I'd like you to do is think about which of those barriers might impede your ability to communicate with your people. And this isn't necessarily a negative reflection on you, because some of those barriers are not necessarily self-imposed. And I'll talk about those in a moment. And I'm going to particularly share with you 5 performance and development conversations that I believe are critically important to your success. And this is in a framework called the 5 Conversations framework. And it comes from my book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, the 10 performance and development conversations that leaders must have. So I'll share with you that, and I think you'll find that very interesting, because I'm going to share with you some research where I've actually implemented this in a large organization, and we can see some results of what they might mean. Okay. Now, I'm sure you're aware that, there are surveys out there that show that, approximately 70% of people are disengaged at work. Now, whether it's 60% or 80%, it's still very high. And we know across the world that that's not changing too much. So we all know what disengagement looks like. We all know what engagement looks like. So I won't go into defining that. But I think what's more disturbing is that 20% of those 70% are what I'd call actively disengaged. In other words, they're actually going out of their way to undermine the good work that you as a leader are doing. You may well have some of them in your team. And so it's a real issue across the globe. And people have tried to do all sorts of things to improve engagement levels, but I think the secret sauce, if you like, is actually engaging in regular conversations, or what we might call catch-ups. I don't call them check-ins, because if we call them check-ins, of course, it implies that you're checking up on people, but catch-ups are very important. And if you wanted to take one thing out of this session more than anything else, and you're not already doing it, you should be having regular catch-ups with your direct reports. Now, you might say, well, what are we going to talk about? Well, I'll be able to give you a little bit of a clue about that throughout the presentation. Okay, so let me talk about the conversation, and let me just talk about a few things that might be of interest here. I wrote a book with Aubrey Warren several years ago called Conversations at Work. And in that book, we both stated that organizations are conversations. So if you actually think about it, the organization that you're working in is actually a series of conversations that are going on throughout the day. Some of them are happening in the boardroom, some of them are happening in the lunchroom, some of them are happening online, some of them are happening in the car park, some of them are happening in the bathroom. They're happening everywhere. And at the end of the day, you can conceptualize organizations as a series of conversations. So if you can improve the quality of those conversations, then what that means is that you're going to do a lot of good things, including improving engagement levels. And so this is my life's work, if you like, around how to elevate the quality of conversations in organizations. Now, many people will probably think, well, are good quality conversations sadly lacking? Well, of course they are, because we have a lot of what Linda Grattan calls dehydrated conversations. And dehydrated conversations are very superficial. Hi, how are you? How was your weekend? So a lot of conversations that go on are around those superficial conversations. And the other type of conversations that go on, of course, are around the projects and the tasks that you do, as they should be. But of course, there's something missing in between, and that's these more in-depth performance and development conversations that I want to talk to you about today. I think a lot of people think that the art of conversation, there's an art form to conversation, and I think that's very misleading. Every one of us who are in this forum today is used to having hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of conversations. So it's not as if we don't have them. And to suggest that it's an art form, I think, is misleading. It's true to say that some of the difficult conversations, such as a performance conversation, do require a skill set, undoubtedly. But I think the idea that we have this sort of idea that it's some art form and I don't have that skill set is a convenient way to say that I won't embrace conversations when I'm working with my people. So I don't think it's necessarily an art form. I think it's very interesting, though, that if your parents were still alive today and you said to them, guess what, Mum and Dad, I attended a online workshop this morning on how to have conversations. I think they'd find that extremely amusing and probably laugh. That's how far removed we've become. And this is the technology that we live in the world we live in. But just because we're living in a technologically capable world does not mean that we shouldn't be able to communicate with each other. And in fact, I would say that it's even more important now than it ever was before. And of course, it does beg the question, have we lost the need for conversations? Because now you can send people emails and texts and all sorts of things, and people do that. But unfortunately, what that means is that we miss out on that humanness that comes, that's very, very important to getting the best from the people that we lead. So I don't think we've lost the need for conversations at all. I think it's more important than ever. I was working with a client a couple of months ago, and this client had a turnover in his business of 35%. So 35 out of 100 people left the business in the course of a year. And he called me in and he asked me to bring my magic wand and he wanted to fix the problem. And I said to him, how are your conversations that your leaders are having? And he said, oh, look, I know your work, Tim. I know all about the 5 conversations framework. He said, I think it's very great, but we don't have time here to have conversations. We're too busy getting the product out the door. So, I, of course, was very careful about how I responded to that, but you can see the irony in that response, can't you? That because there was a disconnection, and if you look at exit interviews, they will tell you clearly the number one reason that people are leaving organizations is because they're not engaged with their leader. And of course, the leader's oblivious to that because it's a very difficult thing to say to a leader, but often we find the truth when we're talking to people in exit interviews. So people leave managers, not organizations as such. And colleagues of mine, Jim Kuzner and Barry Posner, who wrote a great book called Credibility, in their first chapter of the book, it's entitled Leadership is a Relationship. And I think that's a brilliant title. Leadership is a relationship, obviously not a personal relationship, but nevertheless, it's a working relationship. And that poses an interesting question, doesn't it? How does one have a relationship with anyone? The answer, of course, is one conversation at a time. There is no other way. You can perhaps have a relationship with somebody via social media. You can probably have a relationship with someone via email, but not really a strong relationship. And so conversation is critical to forming working relationships, and working relationships are critical to get the best from the people that you lead. So that just sets the scene. I just wanted to share that with you to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from and what I'm on about in terms of conversations. All right, so let's now look at the barriers. Now, as I go through these 9 barriers, what I'd like you to do is to make a note of which of these barriers you find the most challenging. And then when we finish this, when we finish the 9, I'd like you to go into the Q&A box or the chat box and just identify which of these you think is the most challenging for you personally. And these aren't necessarily in any order, but here they are. Probably a key barrier is inattentiveness during conversations. You know, we've all been there, haven't we? Someone talks to someone else and they're looking at their phone, or they're staring over the shoulder of the other person, or they're looking out the window. Clearly they're distracted. And the problem with that, of course, is that the person on the receiving end of that knows that. And because they know that, they probably rightly assume that what the person's doing, fiddling with their phone, is far more important than what I've got to say. And I've seen this happen all the time. People multitask. So, you know, somebody comes into your workspace and you're tapping away on an email, and they're perhaps at your door if you've got an office, and they say to you, you know, I've got can I have a word? And you say, yeah, keep talking. I'm just tapping out this email. Keep going. I'm listening. And of course, what you're trying to do, of course, is be efficient, doing 2 things at once. But in actual fact, you're probably not writing a very good email, and you're probably demonstrating clearly to the other person that they're not that important to the point where you could stop writing your email to listen to what they've got to say. So we make jokes about this, about multitasking, but in actual fact, I would say that one of the biggest barriers is people not paying attention in conversations. And the great management consultant Warren Bennis said the biggest challenge of the 21st century is the management of distraction. And I think he's right. It's very hard for us to give someone 100% undivided attention. But I'd also say to you that if you don't, you're not going to have very effective conversations. So that's one barrier. Another barrier is restricted information channels. I'm sure you've all heard you'll get told on a need-to-know basis, or no news is good news. We often hear these things being said in our workplace. If we restrict the information channels to the people that we lead, then we restrict their perspective on what's going on. And so therefore they don't see things the way you see things. Now, I accept that there are some things that need to be kept private from people that report to you. I understand that. And of course, they should be kept private. But I think there's a lot of things that we don't share. And because we don't share those things, then it creates a problem for us in terms of communication. You might be saying, well, you might be thinking to yourself, well, my manager doesn't tell me everything that I need to know. So how can I share that with my team? Sometimes the best way to share information is ironically to say, look, I've got nothing to share. I've got no additional information to what I said last week in the meeting. So we need to open up the information channels in our workplace. And I think the best yardstick is, if in doubt about whether I should share something, it's probably a good indication that you should share. Thirdly, a lack of feedback. And I wrote a book on this, and you can see on the back of the wall here, Mastering Feedback. We need to get good at feedback. The truth is, feedback is a conversation, or it should be a conversation. In other words, feedback's not about you just letting the other person know what they've done wrong or right. It's actually engaging in a dialogue so that we can get them, that is, the other person, involved in the solution and to get them involved in the interaction. I can recall clearly working in a, I'll mention the industry, but I won't obviously mention the name. But I was working in a local government environment approximately six months ago. And in that environment, there was a person there who, let's call her Marie. Marie had just started. And in fact, she'd been there for about 3 months. So Marie is 19 years of age, and I was sitting down having a conversation with her. And she said to me, I said to her actually, how have you settled in? And she said, I don't know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? And she said, well, I haven't had any feedback. And I said to her, okay, now you can imagine this is a person in their first job. They've been there for 3 months. They've had no interaction, no feedback whatsoever. So I said to Marie, well, would you like me to talk to your manager about that? And she said, oh, that'd be great. So in I go, and he's got a nice, impressive office, and I knocked on the door and I walked in, and the manager was sitting behind this massive black mahogany desk, and he was looking at me over his half-moon glasses like this. And I said to him, you know, Marie started 3 months ago. He said, yes. I said, she'd like some feedback. Do you think you could give her some feedback? Because it'd be good for her to know how she settled in. And the response I got was unbelievable. He looked at me again over his half-moon glasses. There was a long pause, and he said, oh, I couldn't do that. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, whoa, are they having an affair? Is there a conflict of interest? What's going on? Anyway, I said, do you mind if I ask why? And he said, oh, if I give feedback to Marie, I'll have to give feedback to everyone. So you throw your hands up. Feedback's important. So, and the best place to start is just do it daily and just start with the positive feedback. Okay, what's number 4? A culture of not asking questions. Good conversations are actually about asking questions, not answering questions. And that's really important for you to think about. Most of you who are in this development day-to-day have probably got outstanding technical skills. What's happened is you went and did a course. You might have gone to university, TAFE, you might have done some course, and you have got a lot of skills. You have learned to answer questions, because if you're a good accountant, you've got the ability to answer questions. If you're a good engineer, you've got the ability to answer questions and solve problems. And so they put you into a leadership role, and all of a sudden you are required to ask questions, not answer questions. And I would suggest to you that leadership is about asking questions, not answering questions. So get good at asking questions, and that's why, what, when, who, where, how, and which, those type of questions. Number 5, too much formality. The reality is, if you have a conversation in your office or even in the office, it's going to be less effective than it is in a coffee shop. You know why? Because there's a bit of formality. If it's in your office, there's even more formality because it's your space, you feel comfortable, but do they feel comfortable talking to you? Do you want them to feel comfortable talking to you? You should. And I think the best thing I'd suggest is to get out of the office and have that conversation with people. So formality can be a big barrier. And we all know that we have great conversations in informal situations where we're totally relaxed. Why is it any different in our working environment? Number 6, the average person spends more than 2 hours a day on email. And people say, yeah, well, I spend much more than 2 hours. And the problem with an over-reliance on email is that we often try to have conversations with people via email. This is not effective. You know yourself, when you send a question off to somebody else via email, sometimes it's not answered when you want the answer. Sometimes it's answered too late. And sometimes, of course, it's never answered at all. So my suggestion is, if you're a leader and one of your team members asks you a series of questions via email, and they're not necessarily working remotely, and even if they are, they can try another medium. If that's the case, then I would say to them, look, I'm just curious, why did you feel the need to send me that email question? Because I'm on the phone, I'm accessible, just give me a call or just pop in, because it'll save us both time. So that's a barrier. And I think we use email too much for conversations, or at least a substitute for that. Now, if I was going to give you some advice in your organization around how you might improve the quality of your conversations, what I'd be looking at is the leadership team. And you may well be part of that. You may not be. But the reality is, how do your leaders interact with each other? Because what happens is we take our cues from our leaders, and we very much look at what they do. So if leaders have secret meetings, if leaders meet behind closed doors, if leaders come out of meetings as if they've just been in a brawl, then obviously that's just going to be mirrored throughout the organization, and that's a key barrier. So I often start with the senior leadership team in these sorts of programs. Barrier number 8, and I think this is a big one, and that is the fear of emotion. Let sleeping dogs lie, or let's not open a can of worms. Now, both of those, of course, are in our head, and so therefore we don't broach subjects with people. But how do you know for sure that if you broach a subject, it's actually not going to land well? How do you know that? You might have seen past experience, but you don't know for sure. So you're making an assumption about how someone will actually respond to some, constructive feedback that you might be giving somebody else. I just say to you, give it a crack, because just sweeping it under the carpet is not going to make it go away. It'll just manifest itself in different ways. And you all know that in your heart. And I think it's just not worth it. And of course, your other team members also know that, and they want you to deal with these things, and they expect you to deal with it. So it's important to do that. Obviously, it takes some skill, but just take a deep breath and put as much effort and dedication into learning how to have those conversations as you had in getting to the position you're in today. And number 9, something you may not be able to do a lot about, is the physical layout of your office. A quarter of a century ago, architects designed offices with open plans, and you may be working in one of those. And those open plans were designed to improve communication. But of course, as we all know, when you are having a conversation with somebody in an open plan environment, there's probably another dozen people that will overhear it. So the irony is the open plan office has actually stifled communication. And by the time you book the meeting room, it's probably too late. So that's another barrier. So folks, what I'd like you to do at this stage is just go to the chat box, and I'd just like you to type in which of those 9 barriers you think is the one that is probably impacting you the most. And we might just get a bit of feedback from how we go there. But look, I might just keep going, because while people are typing in, I don't want a sort of an awkward pause. So,
hi Tim. Tim, it's
Yep.
Sam here. Just to jump in quickly, that the chat box for some reason isn't working. So can I ask people just to put their comments in the Q&A box instead, and we'll follow that through.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll just keep going, and maybe, just jump in when you're ready and let me know what we're hearing. But look, I'm going to share with you now my 5 conversations framework. And I'm proud to say it's being used all over the world in different organizations to great effect. And when I first when I first put this together, I put it together in a book called The End of the Performance Review. And the reason, you could probably imagine, is that I'm not a great believer in the performance review. And I thought, and in fact, no, there's no research anywhere that shows that performance reviews actually increase performance. So the question is, why do we do them? And it's a good question. And I haven't really heard a good answer yet. So I think the way to go with this, and of course you might be wedded to that in your organization, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, that's fine. You can use this as an enabler. So this can be an opportunity for you to improve the quality of your review, or it can be just used as a good opportunity to have a catch up. So I've given you basically a framework to have a good catch up. So let me go through it very briefly with you. And if you want the precise questions, you can get those from a copy of my book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work. So you'll notice that on the left-hand side, there are 5 months. So the idea is that you'd have one catch-up once a month with each of your direct reports, which isn't, I don't think, a huge ask, unless, of course, you've got 20 direct reports, in which case I'd be saying you've got some structural issues that have to be attended to in your organisation. So conversation 1 is a climate review conversation. And, you know, we spend thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year doing these online surveys on engagement and all sorts of things. And of course, people get very critical and they say, well, I filled out this thing and I've got nothing coming back. So my question is, why don't we just have a conversation about these things? Why do we have to actually down tools and do things online that way? We do know, and you know, you might say, well, people are more honest online. Well, therein lies the problem, isn't it? The question is, why are people more honest online than they would be if they were speaking to you in a conversation? That in itself suggests that your working relationship with that person isn't as robust as it could be. So a climate review conversation is really just about how people's job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So the very first question that I ask when I'm sitting down with someone in a climate review conversation is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how do you rate your current job satisfaction? So what I'm after is a number. And let's say the person gives me a 7. My next question will be, why 7? And now I've opened a doorway to listen to what the person's got to say about their own job satisfaction. We know these things ebb and flow over time, absolutely. But now we're in a position where we can talk about those things at that time. My next question around that would be, do you believe it can ever get from a 7 to an 8? Now, you might say, why would I ask that? Surely everyone could go from a 7 to an 8. Well, some people think 7 is as good as it gets. So I'm checking in with the other person and they say, oh, yes, it could be higher. And then your next question, of course, is what needs to happen for it to be higher? You see, so that opens up a rich conversation about how people are feeling about their work. I can assure you it's a very pleasant conversation. I've done many of these in lots of organizations and there's no drama whatsoever. Then we go to month 2. Instead of starting with what people are no good at, how about we actually start with what people are good at? So this is the strengths and talents conversation. So how do I start that conversation? Well, I ask them this question. What's the one thing that you enjoy most about the work you do? Hopefully they'll say something, but whatever they say is gold. Because what they've told you, so they might like the client interaction, they might like doing spreadsheets. I don't know what they'll tell you. But what they tell you is likely to be their strength. Why? Because there's a high correlation between what people enjoy and what people are good at. And in fact, the research bears this out. So by asking people what they enjoy doing, you're actually unearthing their strength. And then you can ask them, how might you be able to utilize that more effectively in the future? And sometimes you can't, you accept that. So it's a good affirming conversation to talk about what people are good at. You might like to consider that yourself. What do you enjoy most about the work you do? I'll guarantee you're good at that, whatever that is. In conversation 3, I'm expecting people to come to that conversation with one opportunity for growth. So I'm actually asking people to think about something that they can work on in the next 6 months that I can assist them with that'll help with their growth. Now, if someone comes to me in that conversation and says nothing, then I'll send them away and say, I'd like you to give that some thought. The trap you could fall into is to fill the gap by saying, well, let me tell you something. Well, I want them to own their development. I want them to come to that conversation with some thoughts about what they can improve, because it's all about accountability. And then we talk about how you might assist them or what has to happen in order to help them with that growth opportunity. The learning and development conversation is a culmination of conversation 2 and 3. So clearly we've talked about people's strength, we've talked about their opportunities for growth. We're now in a position to talk to them about a learning plan over the next several months. So it's about going back and revising what was discussed in conversation 2 and 3 and working out. Now, again, human resources spends hours doing training needs analyses every year across the organization, depending on its size, of course. And the reality is that, that takes time. Why don't we just sit down and talk about it? Why do we have to do that through, central casting? We can do that. We can record that. We can even put it in a spreadsheet if we need to. Now, whereas conversation 4 is about the individual and their own learning and development, conversation 5 is about the workplace. So this is about innovation and continuous improvement. Again, I want the person to come to that conversation with an idea or a thought about what they can do to improve the working environment. Now, it doesn't have to be, this incredible innovation like touchscreen technology or anything. It could be something as simple as putting up a notice board or starting our meetings on a positive. Whatever it is, I'm there listening and I'm teasing that out. Now, you just think about this for a minute. Imagine the size of your organization. I don't know what size organization, but imagine if in that organization, every single manager was sitting down in month 5, let's say in July, and having an innovation and continuous improvement conversation. Do you think there might be some good ideas come out of that? I'd suggest so. And of course, then it's doing something with it. So there's the 5 conversations framework. You might say, well, when I finish the 5, what do I do next? Well, you go back and start on conversation 1 and you go through it. So ideally, you should go through 2 rounds of the 5 conversations every year. So just imagine again, if your organization, if every leader in the organization had 10, 20-minute conversations with their direct reports every year, can you imagine the difference that that would make in terms of performance and development? I can assure you it would be significant. And you might say 20 minutes, well, there's only 2 or 3 questions for each. And you can have a short conversation that's meaningful, and you can have a long conversation that's dead, dull, and boring. So don't think for a minute that you need to sit there for an hour on each of these. You can do these in 20 minutes. Now, you might at times say, well, this is good. I want to continue. Well, that's fine. That's a decision that you've made. But at the end of the day, they should last you only 20 minutes. So there's no excuse to suggest that it's getting in the way. In fact, it's an investment of your time. So there it is. Now, let me share with you now, I'll just explain to you, I won't mention the organisation, and it wasn't that local government environment I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to share with you some interesting information. I'll tell you this much. It was a government department, and in this government department, it wasn't the whole government department, but was a significant section of the government department I got a phone call, and the phone call was, we've got very low engagement, we've got very low morale, we don't know what to do, can you come in and help? So what I did is I implemented the 5 conversations. We did some induction training, and we, just implemented it exactly as I showed you before. And what we did before we rolled it out, so to speak, is that we actually surveyed people. So we sent out a survey, and the responses were anonymous, but we sent it out to everybody, because what we wanted to get is a baseline of where people were at. And what you're seeing in front of you here is some of the scores. I won't share them all because we don't have time and we've got other speakers, but let me share with you a couple of really interesting results. At the end of one round of the 5 conversations, we surveyed the organisation again. So that was 5 months between the 2 surveys. And think about that. This is 5 20-minute conversations across the board. And so these were the statements that people responded to, and this was the aggregate result. So the first one there, you can see communication between management and staff is reasonably good most of the time. It went from 50 to 77%, which is significant. This is an aggregate, of course. My boss has talked to me about ways to improve my job satisfaction. It almost doubled, 23 to 44. Now you might say, yes, but that's one of the 5 conversations to talk to people about job satisfaction. Exactly. The question might be, well, why wasn't it discussed earlier? Let's look at a few more. My boss has discussed my strengths and talents with me, 44 to 72. My boss has given me feedback on my strengths and talents, significant. My boss is very aware of my strengths and talents, 47 to 67. So you can see the incredible difference in engagement, morale, trust that the 5 conversations can deliver. So it makes a significant difference in terms of the way people do things. And not only did, well, there's 3 more. I have not received enough feedback on my work from my boss. So this was significant because it's a negatively worded statement. So 36% of people said, I'm not getting enough feedback. So it went to 72. So it doubled. It doubled. I feel my boss is getting the best out of me in my current role. Significant. Look at that. Do you think that would make a difference to productivity and performance? Absolutely. I've discussed strategies to grow and develop my current role of my boss, 40 to 55. So significant. And we also here are some statements that came out as well that can give you a little bit of a sense of what people were thinking about the 5 conversations. Questions were not intrusive and could be delivered in a friendly manner. The conversations helped to break down barriers in communication. The 5 conversations framework has fostered more impromptu conversations in the team. That was interesting. Overall, the 5 conversations framework assisted in improving engagement, trust, and relationships. So you can see there's evidence that this works. And you may not want to do this across the organization, but you may want to do it with your team. And I'd strongly recommend that if you do this, you'll get the same sort of results that we're getting there, undoubtedly. So just to sum up before I open up for questions, the beauty of the 5 conversations framework is that it's an ongoing dialogue. So basically that means that it's not a one-off event. It's done over the year, and that's a good thing. It's open and it's direct. So yes, it's open, but it's also direct. So we're asking direct questions, not intrusive, but direct questions. And we're opening up and improving the quality of conversations I was talking about earlier on in the presentation. It's flexible. You can do this on a park bench. You can do this at the depot. You can do this in a boardroom. So that's the good news. You can do this in the car driving back from a client visit. It's timely because we're actually meeting people where they're at that time. And of course, it's far more relaxed than the good old performance review where we've got pen in hand and we're ticking boxes and making, comments and all the rest of it. So it's a far more relaxed, and I'd suggest to you from the feedback we've got, it's a far more effective way of going. Okay. So just finally, before I close out for a Q&A, you might like to consider this. A lot of you would be working with people in remote environments, and you might be thinking to yourself, how does all this work if I'm dealing with people in another state or even another country? Well, it should be no different. You can do these things, of course, online, and you should. And I would strongly urge you to do this. I would argue that it's more important for people working in isolation than it would be if you're in the office, because you can just bump into people in the corridor, but you can't do that necessarily if you're working from home. But if one of your team members is working on a project from home, there may be a reluctance on your part to give them feedback because you weren't standing over their shoulder watching them. You're not sure what they were doing. So you might think, well, I'm not really in a position where I could actually give feedback. Well, try this. Try these 3 questions. So someone's finished a report for you, let's say, and you want to debrief on that report. So obviously you've got the report in your inbox. So yes, you've seen the final result. But you might also say, look, just before we move on to the next thing, what went well in this report from your perspective? Now, people might demur and say, oh, no, I don't think there's anything. Just keep at it, because there's always something good that happened in the way someone did something. And they might say to you, well, look, it was good because I consulted with a number of people that helped me to write the report, and that was a good thing. Okay, great. And then you might say, well, what needs improvement? Now, I don't care how good the report is or how good the piece of work is, there's always something that can be improved. So that question, again, puts the accountability on the individual to tell you what they think should be improved. And you don't have to say much more than that. You just listen to what they have to say. And the third question is, what will you do next time? So next time you've got a report like this to write, what will you do? What will you do differently? And you're obviously after an answer there. Now, I can guarantee to you that is hugely powerful. And I'll tell you why. Because all of the accountability is back on the individual to actually appraise their own performance, you see. And you don't have to be standing over their shoulder. You can just ask the questions, and that can give you a really good response. All right, so that hopefully gives you a sense of what we've covered, and you can see that we've talked about the power of conversations. We've talked about some barriers to conversations, and remember, I shared with you 9 of those. We might get a bit of feedback shortly about that. And of course, I've shared with you the 5 conversations framework, and I would urge you to give that a go. And I've also given you, I guess, some feedback from an organization where we implemented this to great effect. So you can see, of course, that it works. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and we'll have a little bit of a chit chat, and we'll have a conversation. How's that? All right.
Excellent, Tim. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a fantastic presentation, and certainly taken a huge amount of notes in my action plan to take back to my leadership team and to the organisation here at the Institute. So thank you very much. We're very privileged to have you today. So let's get into a few questions because there's been a number that have come through. We've got over 114 responses in the Q&A. They're not all questions, Tim. They were comments and things like that. But one of them that stood out to me just as it came through was, which I think is highly relevant, and we will stay on the 5 conversations framework for the minute, and we might work back just because it's quite fresh. But
sure.
If you have a larger team, this is from Bianca, if you have a larger team, 17 direct reports,
yes,
it might be hard to do the 5 conversation framework every month with every team member. I'm wondering whether there's any evidence that having the conversation bi-monthly has any efficacy?
Oh, look, I think I don't know any evidence that suggests that it should be, done bi-monthly or monthly or whatever, but I think it should be regular. There's no question about that. So I think you just need to work around that. But I would say to you, if you've got 17 direct reports, I'd be probably suggesting to you a couple of things. I'd probably be talking to your manager about, making some structural changes there, because quite frankly, it's very difficult to be managing 17 direct reports, as I'm sure you would allude to. The other possibility, of course, is that amongst those 17 reports, there may be some people there who can act as your, maybe not 2IC, but something along those lines. And you could delegate to them the opportunity to actually have those conversations with some of your team. So you can lighten the load that way. You're still going to have a conversation with that person anyway, so you can get some feedback on how that's all going. So I'd recommend something along those lines.
Thanks, Tim. If you follow the 5 conversation framework and your staff member is still showing apathy and disengaged, is there another direction or make adjustments to the 5 conversation framework that you would suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have come across that in various times. I think that what that would suggest to me is that there isn't a good quality working relationship between you and the other person. I'm not saying it's your fault, by the way. I'm just saying it's probably the fact. Now, it might be that they don't have a good quality relationship with anybody. And, the reality is you might have to have the tough performance conversation with them. But try this as an intervention. Organize a meeting with them, and just sit down with them and ask them this question, because you just take a deep breath and just say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate our working relationship? Now, that'll blow them away because they won't expect that. You just got to hold the line and be courageous enough to ask that question. And, they'll wriggle a bit and carry on. You just say, no, give me a number. And let's say they say 4. And then you say, why? And they say, whatever they might say, and just say, okay, what is it that I can do that could help it get from a 4 to a 5? Right? The onus of responsibility is on the other person. But there's nothing intrusive that's gone on yet except the fact that you've asked for a number. And sometimes that can open up a doorway to a different conversation that might just break the barrier, because there's a barrier there. But at the end of the day, some people are like this, and, you might just have to have the hard conversation with them. But I'd try that one first.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Great advice. Here's a couple of people who have suggested this. What are tips to approach people who are totally not interested in any personal growth?
Well, yeah.
And they're sort of just happy to just float along, they're happy with what they've got.
Well, I think, there's a difference between performance. People, if you've got your minimum acceptable standard performance here, it's probably unrealistic to expect that everyone's going to be a world beater. So I think, first of all, let's get that clear, that if people are coming to work and doing their job to a minimum acceptable standard performance, then, just be at peace with that, because, not everyone is a world beater, but I mean, they meet the standard. There's got to be a standard there. But I think at the end of the day, personal learning to grow and develop is non-negotiable. So I would be appealing to them in terms of their own career, because at the end of the day, it's not, if they think it's just about, going to training courses to please you, it's not about that. It's all about their own growth and development, because the world is moving at this rapid warp speed, as we all know. And if people don't want to develop themselves, I'm afraid they're doing themselves out of their career. Frankly, that's what's happening. So I try that approach and just see what comes out of that. But sometimes they may be frightened of trying something new or being shown up. And it's what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset. So a fixed mindset is thinking that there's nothing I can really do with what I've got. I am what I am, as Popeye said. And the truth is, it is what I am. And of course, you've got to break through that. So try a different conversation around career.
Excellent advice. Thanks, Tim. So here's one, and this I think comes back to that fear of emotion, in terms of words. When you have conversations, words can have multiple meanings. If someone's in a negative frame of mind about things, they're going to interpret the words differently to perhaps what the giver is saying. So, how do you handle that situation, and I guess how to make sure that those words are interpreted in the right way?
Yeah, well, look, the first thing I do is I think carefully about the words that you're going to use, even to the point of writing them down. I know that sounds a bit hokey, but if you sat down and got a piece of paper out and just wrote down exactly how you'd express it, it actually gives you confidence that you're going to say the right things. Now, even if you say the right thing, sometimes people get upset. I understand that. But let's make sure they don't get upset because if you said to someone, for example, you're always late to meetings. Well, you might think they're always late to meetings, but there's probably an example where they weren't late to a meeting. So that wouldn't be a good idea. It's far better to say, look, you were late for the last 3 meetings and I want to talk to you about that. Well, that's better, right? So get your wording right and make sure you're talking about the behavior and not the person. And I often think the way to do it is to use this approach. It's called SBI. You talk about the situation, you talk about the behavior, and you talk about the impact. So the S is the situation. At this morning's meeting, right? So I've now anchored it back to something. You interrupted Fred when Fred was making a key point, right? That's the behavior. And it happened, right? Impact is really important. Say, my concern about that is that Fred may feel reluctant to contribute anything meaningful to future meetings because of that. Now, the other person might say to you, oh, yeah, but I was just correcting Fred. Say, well, yeah, that may well be true. I don't want to go there. What my concern was is that Fred might not feel comfortable contributing in future meetings. That's my concern, not whether you're right or wrong. So try the SBI model. That's another suggestion.
Thank you. Great advice, Tim. One final question, and I'm sorry we haven't, as I said, there's 125 comments and questions here, and we haven't got to all of them. So my apologies that we haven't been able to answer all of them, but I hope I've tried to focus on the topics where there has been a lot of comments and conversation. One final question from a fellow of the Institute, and I know Phil very well, on the Northern Beaches. Brilliant common sense and easy, simple frameworks, Tim. General question, is technology impacting generationally on the simple human skill of conversing and connecting?
It's a great question, Phil, and I've thought about it a lot. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it's far easier to send someone a text than it is to talk to them. So in that sense, we're using technology to move away from conversations. But I must say the evidence that I've got anecdotally working with, and of course, there's this kind of thinking that, younger people are not adept at having conversations. But I'd have to say to you that when I work with young people in their, early stages of their career, and I share with them this framework, they love it. They love it. So it's a bit of a myth. I think it's just because they've been brought up in a world of technology and, they haven't really been, showing my age, but, in my day, you just talk to people, that's the way it was. But now, of course, it's different. So I think humans need to connect, not in a soppy way necessarily. They just need to connect. And I think that will never, ever go away. So it's just about giving them some frameworks and training, I think, Phil. Yeah, that'd be my view anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. A sensational session and certainly spurred a lot of comments and questions. And we could probably be here for another hour answering and talking about it all. But I thank you so much for bringing your life's work to today's session, and certainly can recommend the work that you've done, and we can see that the book's behind you there, and all the work you've done. Certainly recommend that as from the Institute. It's been a sensational session, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Cheers. Bye. Thanks,
Tim. And just before we move on, we're going to be back in half an hour with Pam Harris for Think on Your Feet. This will be the second session for today's development day, and there'll certainly be some wonderful skills talked about in that session as well with Think on Your Feet. For those leaving us after Tim's session today, thank you very much for your attendance, and please keep an eye on the resources email. So this will come out this afternoon. It will have the recording of Tim's session, and it will have a lot of resources that Tim has provided us and talked us through today that is associated with his presentation that you can use and implement as a manager and leader in your workplace. And also take the time to review what's on offer here at the Institute. As I said at the outset, we're the largest community of managers and leaders across Australia and New Zealand. We love putting on leadership programs. We love training and short courses and events and putting on sessions like Development Day. So please, I encourage you to be involved and get involved in the Institute, and look out for what's coming up in the future at the Institute, and the opportunity to grow with our community of members. So once again, thank you very much to Dr. Tim Baker for the first session. We look forward to seeing you all in 30 minutes with Think on Your Feet. Thank you very much.